So let's talk about the tools of the trade when it comes to soldering. First, we have, of course, our solder. The solder that I have here is 0.031 inches in diameter. It's 6040, which we'll talk about later, and it's rosin core. Rosin core is important because now we don't have to use flux on our boards, and it makes for a much cleaner environment. We also have a solder that's half this diameter. We'll use that solder when we do surface mount devices or smaller devices in general. Now, one thing that's really important when we solder is to keep the tip clean. We do that a couple different ways. First of all, we use tip tinner. Tip tinner is used to put a coating on the solder tip so the solder tip does not oxidize. Once a solder tip oxidizes, it's very difficult to get that oxidation off, and it can damage the tip. Tips are very expensive. We don't want to have to replace them. So therefore, we use tip tinner. You use this after you get done putting a solder joint on. You put the tip in the tip tinner, and then you return it back to the holder. We can also use scrubbers and sponges. The scrubber, just simply kind of twist it in there. That will also clean it. Or we can wet the sponge and we can drag it over the sponge. That also works well too. Depending on what situation you're in or what you're soldering, sponge might be better than a scrubber. I'll demonstrate that in a different video. Now, in the case that you put a component in the wrong position, or maybe put a wrong component in general, we have to remove it. And by removing it, what we have to do is remove the solder. We have two tools to do that. We have desoldering wire, also known as wick, and we have a solder sucker. The desoldering wire, or wick, is braided copper. All we do is we heat up a piece of this braided copper, we put it on the solder joint, and put the iron on top of the braided copper, and it literally wicks the solder into the braided copper. It's a very clean way to do it. If you have a lot of solder that you have to get off, a solder sucker is a better way to go. It draws the solder up into the cylinder, and again, I'll demonstrate both of these in a later video. You also want to have on hand tweezers, especially if you're dealing with surface mount devices. You can't manipulate them with your hand, they're too small. So you always want to have a good pair of tweezers. They're also good to kind of make sure components are in the right spot when you are just prior to soldering. We bend a lot of components, resistors and capacitors, so we need needle nose pliers. You'll notice the radius changes as you go up the nose of the pliers, so we can get different radiuses when we bend, and I'll do a demonstration of that also. Then we also have to cut extra leads off, so we want shears. One-sided shears, we only want them to come out one way. We don't want the shear to push both ways. So a one-sided shear. It's always a good idea also to inspect your solder joint after you have done it. This has a little extra magnifier in there. I have magnifying glasses in class, and there's a bigger one over on the counter if needed. So of course, the most important part of soldering is the solder iron itself. You have the tip, you have the reservoir, and you have where you hold it, spongy material. Never hold it down here. You'll only do it once. Make sure you hold it on the spongy handle. As I said before, this is very important to keep this clean. We never lay this down on the table when we're soldering. We always return it to the holder. And we'll talk about temperature and stuff like that in later videos, and you'll see some more demonstrations of all of these things.